What's up, early humanities people? Rick Bain coming at you here. Just wanted to go ahead and do my discussion, and I wanted to let you know about Popol Vuh, which is the Quiche people's creation narrative, and it gives a lot of way for what their religious views are, and it tells you about their gods and their morals and their values, principles, ideas, and beliefs. So, first off, I wanted to talk about why it's important to understand a creation narrative and what a creation narrative does for people. If you're interested, I have my Power Slide PowerPoint thing that I created attached so you can follow along with me. I'm going to try to follow that as best as I can. I have that pulled up on my phone, like the professionals do. So, I think that a creation narrative is important because it gives you a context about what the foundation of a society or a culture is. It tells you what their values are and what their principles and ideas are. In the Judeo-Christian society and culture, you have a different type of creation narrative than you do with the Quiche people through the Popol Vuh. So it helps give you context about their history and where they come from, and why they may think a certain way or why they may act a certain way. So it's very important, I think, to understand a creation narrative. And it's important to understand that creation narrative from a first-person source, from an original text like we're doing with this assignment. So it's important to read an original text and get that understanding completely. So the Popol Vuh is the Quiche people, who are a Mesoamerican culture society who dwelled in Central America. They were hunter-gatherers slash basic agricultural people. They subsisted mainly off of maize, which is like corn, but it's not totally corn, or it's a predecessor to corn. There are many different types of maize, but it doesn't matter. That was their main food source, what they relied on, and so they were involved with nature, they worked around nature, and their life subsisted and sustained from nature. So that was a very big thing with them. They didn't want to abuse their privileges. They didn't want to abuse nature and creation, but they wanted to live with it, work with it, and thrive off of it. So the contents of the Popol Vuh, it actually was translated after the conquistadors came in, so there's a question of how much of it has been influenced by the Judeo-Christian influencers from the conquistadors who would have pushed that creation narrative and view onto them. And we see that in the first book where there is a giant flood, and that could be questioned and said, is that from the flood that is talked about in the biblical flood, or is it just that all different cultures and religions, creation narratives speak of some sort of flood like that? The flood is actually important for the Popol Vuh and what they teach in the first book, what happens in the first book. And I think that that part of the story is actually very important, but we'll get to that. So the contents, there's multiple books. There's different parts. Each book has different characters and gods that you learn about, and the characters are important, the gods are important, because they all have a different aspect towards the creation. So the gods, the heart of heaven is the thing that creates the world, and there's a giant green feathered bird that brings land up from the abyss, from the waters. It was all just waters and darkness. So everybody plays a role in this creation narrative. And each person is important and has a different metaphorical feature that you could get really deep into, because I think that everybody has some sort of connotation to it. So the first book, the creation begins, as I said, with the heart of heaven making the earth. He makes the earth. The green bird helps pull it up out of the waters. And then from this, the animals are able to be created. So the animals are now dwelling on the land, and the gods are like, okay, so what do we do now? So they create humans, the first type of humans. This first type of humans are made out of mud. So they don't last long. They crumble or they melt with water. So the gods are like, they're useless. They can't think, they can't speak, and they can't live. They're not hardy enough to live. So that gets thrown out of the window. And the second type is made, which is a carved wood human who can talk and who can think and is hardy enough to sustain themselves and live, doesn't crumble or fall apart. But these humans are not able. I don't know if I said they could speak, but they can't speak. They cannot speak. So they're not actually able to praise the gods. And this is a big thing. They're not able to worship the gods and have gratitude and praise and, appreciation for what they've been given in nature and from the gods. So the gods are like, this doesn't work for us. They don't find favor in them. And I think that this prototype of humans they're also abusive in nature, because the gods send a swelling flood. They swell the waters and eradicate these people. But it's not just the flood that gets rid of them. It's also these 4 different birds. If you're following along, you can see it has a different way of putting this. But these 4 different birds tear out the eyes, tear off the heads, devour the flesh, and break the bones and sinews of these men, grinding them into powder. So it's not just that they get eradicated from a flood that comes in, but the animals and the creatures and nature itself is like, we're done with you. So I believe that these wood-carved humans were abusive in nature. And this goes back into why the Quiche people and Central American people would have wanted to be more symbiotic in their relationship with nature and work with it. So we see how a belief system or a creation narrative works with how the people actually lived. So it's not just that the birds tear them apart, but there's also different sayings in it about how the dogs and all sorts of animals are like, we're going to eat you just like you ate us. You burned our backs, and now we're going to eat your backs and burn your backs. And even the utensils are going against the humans, these wood-carved humans, to eradicate them because they're so tired of them. In the second book, you have the second book is really the most important by some sources, because it talks about these 2 brothers who go through different trials, and they end up being the sun and the moon. They go through trials that their fathers had passed away in, being tempted to go into the underworld. So they're 2 favorable guys who are really good at the ball game, the rubber ball game that Mesoamerican people played. So that gives them a lot of favor and a lot of superiority. They fall back on that a lot in this story. Whenever they're in trouble, it's kind of like they challenge people to that game, and then they end up winning and they get out of the situation. But they go through a lot of trials and tribulations and have a lot of hardships that they have to get through, including a house of lances, a house of cold, house of tigers, house of fire, and house of bats, all with its own trial. Heat, cold, lances, they have to survive through death and get a certain type of fruit. So there's a lot of different motifs coming through here, and tones and imagery that would be important to structuring their society and what they find important and what they find not so important. The second book doesn't have so much to do with the creation part as it does the ideas and principle part of the Quiche people, society, and culture. What it does have to do with the creation is where 400 youths get slain, and then in the end, the 2 brothers end up becoming the sun and the moon, and the 400 youths become the stars. So then we head on to the third book, where the heart of heaven creates 4 men made out of yellow and white maize. And these men are actually too perfect. So the gods are like, okay, they can obtain like a godlike qualities and features. So we actually need to inhibit them. We need to stop them from being so perfect. So they put a cloud over their eyes so that they can't see all of earth, so that they're not so knowing and knowledgeable, and so that they have to rely more on the gods and more on what the gods have given them and more on nature. They can't completely self-sustain. and they're more vulnerable, which once again goes back into how did the Quiche and Central American people live in their lives? Well, they sustained and subsisted themselves off of nature. So that goes back into these people came from the Quiche people's main source of food, which was maize. And that's what the Quiche people are from. Sorry, I have a low battery, so hopefully this doesn't cut out. But that's important to know. It's important to know that they're from that and that they were actually perfect, and then they had to be made imperfect so that they would rely on the gods and nature and not just themselves. Eventually, the Quiche people, these 4 men are given 4 women, which lead to the Quiche people and to different tribes and families who are given fire, and then rains come through and knock out that fire. And the lands are harsh and cold and brutal at this time. And so they start venturing out. And one of these original men stays at this mountain that's named after a god that was prophesied that the sun would come out here. And the sun does come out. And that's kind of the end of the creation story. So it's different from a Judeo-Christian story where, sorry, excuse me for 1 second. Different from a Judeo-Christian story where the sun and the moon and all of those things are kind of created one after another. It's interesting that we see that the land is created, the animals are created, the humans are created, and then finally the sun is created. So I think that that's something to look at because it makes the sun more important. It makes the world hot and makes it possible to grow different crops like maize, which they sustain off of. They live and get their nutrients and food from this. So this gives a context about why was the sun worshipped maybe, or why was the sun important to them. So once the sun comes out, the first Quiche city is erected. And there's a lot of connotations to the story. I think there's a lot of metaphors and principles that we can learn from the story and everything that it has in it about what mattered to them most and why it mattered to them most. So this story provides a foundation to their society. It gives their people and their society an identity to base their culture and what they believe off of, which is very important because you can't go anywhere if you don't know where you're from. That's why history is important. That's why religions are important. That's why humanities is important. So we understand what our ancestors were like or what the people before us were like and what they did. So in conclusion, the creation story is obviously crucial because it helps the society itself create. It helps it become what it was, which we don't know everything about these Mesoamerican people, which I think is just fascinating. But it helps create them, but it also helps us have a connotation about who somebody is. Even in our modern day and age, I think getting somebody's foundation, where their ideology and identity comes from, is important because it can help us have a context about what does that person think, what is their social psychology, what's important to them, what are their values. And so that's why it's important to kind of dive into some of these texts and something like the Popol Vuh, which gives you that context and history. That's all I got for this week. Enjoy and be safe.